Welcome back to Highly Respected. I'm your host, Scott Greer, and today we're going to have a fantastic and incredible episode for you guys today, so hopefully you enjoy. And obviously our topic today is going to be the ICE shooting. Actually, and also the Greenland taking, or the idea of us potentially taking Greenland. I didn't get any questions about Greenland, but I will cover that as part of our second main topic today. But I did get a lot of questions about the ICE shooting. James, Ken, and New England Refugee asked about my thoughts on it. New England Refugee has a specific hypothetical he wants me to address, so I'll address that at the end. And then we'll move on to the tensions with Europe over Greenland. So the ICE shooting, it's 100% justified. I think if you watch all the videos, if you look at any of the evidence, the video from the cell phone camera of the ICE officer who shot Renee Good shows that he's completely in the right. You have Good and her lesbian partner creating a disturbance, trying to interfere with the officers. They're clearly trying to block their activities. They issue an order to step outside of the vehicle, and they're detaining her, and she disobeys police commands. That is a crime. And she then tries to drive at him, and she's likely a bad driver. And I don't know if she intentionally tried to drive at the officer, but it had the effect of making the officer think she's driving at him because she's likely a stupid, bad driver. She's panicking because she's like, oh shit. And then she's like, oh, I'm actually going to get arrested for this. And then, her lesbian lover is telling her, drive, baby, drive. And then she drives, and the lesbian lover is encouraging her to commit a crime, to resist arrest, and potentially drive into a law enforcement officer. So it is a crime, and he emptied his mag. And the fact that the officer had been dragged and nearly killed by an illegal alien who they were trying to detain a few months prior, and that this has been a major problem with ICE officers, that people have been trying to drive into them and resist. I mean, there was a lot of cases in the Chicago area over this. So no, it's 100% justified. But it's bound to make people upset. And I'm not surprised liberals are trying to turn this into another George Floyd situation where they're like, oh, this is terrible. How can we do this? And I think James asked is like, do you think that this is a PR disaster for the admin? Well, it's likely not good with normies, but it's still justified and necessary. I mean, it wasn't good for normies when they saw the George Floyd thing. Normies have weak stomachs. Normies are easily propagandized and brainwashed into thinking the dumbest things about current events. And in certain cases, you just need to say whatever to do things necessary. And if you're wanting to hype up mass deportations and to have an ICE agents go into areas that are protecting illegal immigrants, and a lot of the locals are trying to protect illegal immigrants, you're going to have these type of confrontations. And so this is a natural result of Trump's policies. Now, I think the left getting up in arms is no surprise. I knew this was going to blow up when it happened, because if it had been an illegal immigrant who clearly was it was a clear case of them trying to resist, and then it turns out they're an MS-13 gangbanger. Even with the case of George Floyd, not as sympathetic of a character. And especially if they're not speaking English, it creates a harder degree of greater gulf between the ordinary normie audience and the person who was shot. Now, Renee Good is a white 37-year-old mother. She, speaking English, she looks like a normie. She is, in fact, a radicalized normie. And so there creates that degree, it's like, this could happen to me. And, most of the media coverage is trying to portray this as the mother of the year, despite her not having a job and her being trained to interfere with ICE actions and maneuvers. Her being a warrior against ICE, as her friends and activists were calling her. But they portray that she was just a mother dropping her kids off to school, and then she didn't know what to do in a roadblock, and then it happened. Which the cell phone video clearly shows that this is an intentional act. that they were trying to interfere with ICE activity. The lesbian lover gets out of the car. They're blocking the road. She's not, and that's not how you have your vehicle parked you don't park your car in the middle of the fucking road. So it's like, why is she doing this? And she's clearly interfering with police activity. She's resisting arrest, and then she's probably a bad driver and drove in the direction of the ICE officer, and he apparently got nipped in the hip by this, and he had just experienced this. And if you experience a stressful, traumatic experience like that, and you see it happening again, and he pulled out his gun really quick and emptied it into her, this is the type of thing that's going to happen. And I'm not surprised that this happened at all, because the left is encouraging violent confrontation with ICE. Their constituents, I referenced this in my AmCon article over the weekend, is that Democratic offices have been blown up by their constituents demanding that they violently confront ICE. So this is why all these Democratic lawmakers are staging these PR ops to be like, I'm resisting arrest or I'm stopping ICE. There was that former Media Matters staffer, Kat, I'm not going to try to pronounce her name, but she got arrested at an ICE thing, and now she's being charged with resisting ICE activity. And all these Democrats are getting in there, and now they're going full abolish ICE, and they're thinking ICE is a terrorist group. And we've seen this a lot. I mean, a lot of these Hispanic gangbangers have shot at them and used lethal force. The white Antifa and leftists haven't really used lethal force yet. Or maybe you could say that good intentionally did it or unintentionally. Whether it's intentional or unintentional, you don't resist arrest after blocking police activity and then try to drive away, and you being a bad driver, you drive right into an ICE agent. You don't do that. And this is the type of shit that's going to happen to you if you do stupid shit. And that's what happened with Renee Good. So I think it's 100% justified. If it's a bad PR move, what do you guys want to expect? If you think this is bad PR, then you want the administration to stop doing deportations. You want them to stop doing the ICE raids. You want them to you basically want them to pull back from their immigration policy and then follow the old immigration policy of just not really deporting people unless a city or state arrests some pedophile or murderer and it turns out to be an illegal immigrant, and they actually report his immigration status to federal authorities, which a lot of cities don't fucking do. Then you're like, okay, that's all we're going to deport. So deportation numbers would plummet if that's the case. And when everybody brings up these numbers about Biden and Obama were deporting more, the reason why they're deporting more is they counted all the people they were turning away at the border. And when you're like Biden, you're having over 100,000 migrants come every month. Really, over 150,000, over 200,000 in a lot of months. You have a lot of people to turn away to boost your deportation numbers. But they were doing zero internal deportations. Absolutely zero deportations internally. They were not going out and arresting people unless it was some extreme case of this guy's a hardened criminal and he's about to be released, and they don't have anywhere to go do with him. And the Biden administration announced in 2021, Mayorkas went out there and said, we're not going to deport anyone unless you commit a really serious crime. And it's basically like aggravated rape and murder. And they're first going to have to serve a lengthy sentence. So they're essentially announced a complete amnesty on all illegal immigrants for doing this. And it's even the same with, Obama, is that Obama just began aggressively turning away people at the border to boost deportation numbers in order to bamboozle Republicans into thinking he was serious about border security, but was doing hardly any internal, deportations. And so when you have high numbers of illegal immigrants at the border, you can then boost your deportation numbers. Trump is getting historically the lowest illegal entries on record. We're getting like 5,000 migrants coming to the border every month, and they're immediately turned away. Now, that's a good thing because we're getting hardly any illegal immigrants, but you can't expect them to boost numbers from the border. So pretty much all their deportation numbers are people that they're deporting from the interior. And in order to do this, you have to have actions like this. And so the real response, like, I'm not surprised the left went over this. I mean, I think we're going to have more incidents like this. It's just natural. If you want me at mass deportations, this is the cost of it. It's going to make a lot of the public queasy and, get weak knees. It's just expected. I knew this would be the case not last year. It's last year is now 2025, but I knew this was the case in 2024 when I saw the public, getting weak stomachs over things. I saw people on the right being like, "We can't fire people who celebrated Trump's near assassination. That's wrong." And I saw this all the time, and I was like, dude, the public is not going to have, even our own side, it's not going to have the stomach to do this stuff. And with our side, they have not had the stomach to see this. But it's surprising with the left that they're melting down, but they're not having riots. I'll go to New England refugees question on this about the matter riots at the end. But I really want to go off on the rights. The amount of people who are somehow crying over, who are right-wingers who are crying over Renee Good. And a lot of these people are doing this are, and I'm not using a pejorative, are Nazis. And especially this one guy I got into an argument with is like Morgoth, who is like this British right-winger. I don't know what's up with British right-wing influencers on Twitter, but they're pretty much all universally like terrible. And it's, I don't support X's idea, or not X's idea, but Britain's idea to shut down X. In Britain, that would be bad for us, but it would have the silver lining of never having to hear from these terrible British right-wingers who spend all their time like talking about how Trump sucks and it's like time for revolution, and they're like 50 years old and incapable of violence. And one of these guys is like Morgoth. And Morgoth is like, this is petty sadism and just weak, impotent beta cuck rage. And this guy has like all these calls for violence in recent years. He's like, we need to hang these people and all this stuff. And he, in the past, had celebrated Day of the Rope, right-wing death squads, and he tried to claim that this is fake because it was from a left-wing Antifa site. And it's like, look, I didn't want to cite it, but, it is your words. And a lot of when people throw that back, it's like, you can't cite that. That's from a bad source. I have right-wingers every fucking day send my docs to me over some dispute. If I tweet out NFL results, I'll then send that somebody will be in my fucking mentions showing my docs to me and celebrating I got like consequences for my docs. And these are fucking right wingers. So I hate this fucking argument because nobody on the right shares this argument where it's like, we can't rely on left wing sources of people saying stupid stuff. It's like people do this all the time. It's selective standards. And he was like, he's siding with left wingers on this. But this is like the fact is like half the people who are the vast majority of right wingers who are doing this are people who celebrate Hitler, who will defend the Einsatz group, and sometimes they'll be like have people with Oscar Derlevanger Avis, and they're like, this is outrageous, this is petty sadism. I'm like, look at your fucking Avi, man. Look at your profile picture. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? It's like the funniest thing is that the people who are most inclined to cry from the right, or most likely to cry over the ICE agent, are also the most inclined to defend the Nazis and their actions in World War II. And you're like, what is going on here? And it's a lot of the old Wignats. I don't think they're very reflective of even sentiment among the broader right. I think this is similar to in 2020 where a lot of Wignats were hardcore COVID lockdown people, initially supported the George Floyd protests. And when they saw George Floyd, they're like, you've got to have sympathy for this because the police state will also do this to white activists. And there was a lot of people saying this stuff. Once the riots broke out, there was some initial support for the riots as a great demonstration and campaign against Western capitalism or something. They immediately realized that the side was on a different level, moved into it. And now they're doing this with the ICE officer. I'm not surprised they were like upset about Maduro. There's a lot of non-interventionists and a lot of like anything that, they oppose anything America does and they want to destroy the empire. There's a lot of, if you go to like UN's review and stuff, this is reflected in the opinions of those writers and other things. But here, you're like, How are you guys like really hostile to it? And they use bad arguments. They're like, oh, this guy, the ICE officer, is married to a Filipina. First off, like at least a third of white nationalists who are married to non-whites. I mean, the Return of the Land guys are complaining that like they get all these applications from guys with non-white wives. Like this might also burnish his right-wing credentials by being married to a Filipino. Of course, I'm not supportive of this, but in this situation, I'm not going to care, especially when these guys don't care depending on the circumstances, and they also elevate non-white voices themselves. So I don't want to say it is very enervating. It's very frustrating to see these voices and takes gain credence. I mean, some of the guys, like the people in America saying this is stupid, but it's all the Euro right wingers were also into this because they're all, butthurt over the Greenland stuff, and they're also mad about Venezuela. And so this just added a new thing like America's insane asylum. How could you do this? We don't do this in Europe. And well, of course you don't. You just let them drive over you, and then you let them out and out of prison, and don't deport them. Like that's what happens in Europe. Like you almost reward these people as you don't have a real ICE agency. Their deportations strategy in Europe is to issue them deportation notices and then hope that they deport themselves. And usually they don't deport them. It's like continental Europe has all of Europe has a huge problem getting rid of these illegal migrants. And whenever you read these crime stories or terror stories, they're all people who got told that they're no longer allowed in the country, but then they stay there anyway, and they're like, "Well, make me," and they're like, "Please," they don't have a real ICE agency to go after these people, or they have nothing like ICE, are as given as much power to be as aggressive as ICE. So it's something, but a lot of people on the online right are just there to take contrary positions to the rest of the online right, and that's their only that's their sole politics. If we're for Trump, they're anti-Trump. If we're for the ICE agent, they're against the ICE agent. If we're for toppling Maduro, even though there's a lot more debate over that, and I think that's more reflective of broader right-wing tendencies, or at least people who are into online right stuff, I think that's better reflective of the audience. I don't think the audience was that like I don't think much of our audience actually agreed with like the anti-ICE takes, but they'll take any contrary position. It's why they'll like defend Mamdani, AOC, all these leftists, and eventually at the end of the day they just become vote Democrat for base reasons and leftist for base reasons. But it doesn't matter if it's for base reasons. In practice they're leftists, and so they're basically leftists who like Hitler. And it's something that you have to realize with a lot of the elements of the online right. But I don't think it's reflective, but it was very idiotic with some of these people. But I think with the Euro right wingers, they're just a lot of these British guys, even though they fantasize about mass murder and stuff, that it becomes another way to counter signal America and the rightoids of the online right. And so I got into it, and it's relating to the Greenland stuff. But I'll get into that in a moment. I'll go to New England refugees specific question where he asked, do you believe that if Renee Good was black, there would have been looting? Well, I guess you meant rioting. They haven't really done any of the looting and rioting yet. There's been a lot of police shootings and stuff, and people are like, this is going to be a long, hot summer, and then nothing happens. I don't think they don't seem to really want to do that stuff anymore with blacks. I mean, they still have the potential to do it, but we've had a lot of police shootings and other things where people are like, there's going to be a long, hot summer. I'm like, they don't do this. They haven't done this since 2020. And even before 2020, they didn't seem as eager to do it. I think it was all... When Trump got into power, they really stopped rioting. There was a ton of rioting in the mid 2010s. Is that it started in Ferguson, then it went to Baltimore, and pretty much after any police shooting, there was a good chance of rioting. And in the lead up to Trump's election, there was 3 riots, major riots, in 3 different cities in the months leading up. There was one in Baton Rouge. There was one in Milwaukee, and there was one in Charlotte, and then also there was also the assassination of officers by a black nationalist in Dallas. I think that was in June or July. So there's a lot of violence in June and July of 2016. So there's a lot of this violence. Then once Trump's got into power, the riots quiet down. We're still having police shootings, but they're not really doing it. Then they got cooped up with COVID, and people lost their minds, and then they started doing mass riots, and the whole liberal media and normies are apparently in support of it, but it really hasn't been the case since then. Now, I think that if she was theoretically black, maybe, but blacks are not getting involved in ICE enforcement. This is really just Hispanics and white liberals. That's it. Like, blacks are not involving themselves in this shit. It's like blacks are very I'm gonna try to think the word. It's like not really active in politics right now in terms of like street activism. They aren't getting that involved. If you look at a lot of the big radical events, they've not really been involved. They weren't the ones voting for Mamdani. They were voting for Cuomo in the elections. They were not going for Mamdani. They haven't been involved in any street protests involving Trump. It's all Hispanics have been activated when it's involving their community. Most of the people who are capable of violence. It is these Hispanic gangbangers who are getting in fights, shootouts with them, and that's what happened in Portland. Whereas, two people affiliated with MS-13 who got in a firefight with ICE officers. So, that's the type of things that are happening. But blacks are just not getting involved in all. I think some electorally they're not going to vote Republicans, but I guarantee you in Chicago and elsewhere they're like, hell yeah, they're taking our jobs. Get them out of here. They're taking our houses. So they probably don't give that much of a shit about this. So they're not going to get involved in this in the first place. This is entirely Hispanic and white libtards, and I think that also prevents the outside of the left-wing cities where they can mobilize a large Antifa contingent, such as Portland, potentially Seattle, maybe Minneapolis. I think if it was warmer, I think you would have had riots break out. They would have not been on the scale of 2020 because they wouldn't have had the black community there. They are getting Somalis though activated because there is like videos of these Somalis. These ICE guys are trying to do some type of arrest or some type of raid. And these Somali community, there's like hundreds of them, and they're just like shouting in their foreign tongue and going nuts, and the ICE officers retreat. And I think that they could get the Somalis involved, that the non-Somali blacks are not going to get involved. And I think that in order to have the type of scale of rioting that we saw in the 2020s, outside of Portland, which Portland has hardly any blacks and was completely Antifa driven, and I think they could also do that in Seattle. Minneapolis is one of the other hardcore Antifa places that maybe they could, but in 2020 they still depended on blacks to be there. And I always talked about this with the 2020 riots, is that the white element or the Antifa element was always trying to go against symbols of authority. They would lay siege to courthouses, government buildings, and get in fights with cops. The black element would just loot and do wanton mayhem. The Antifa types were much more strategic in where they went, and that's why in Portland they laid siege to the courthouse, while in most of these cities they would just go and loot the local Foot Locker. And so that was dependent on that. But they still need that black element to provide enough manpower to do this. But we'll see. I think it's that we're not gonna have riots. It's really fucking cold in Minneapolis, so people don't want to riot when it's really cold, and they don't have the NBA element. They could get the Somalis, but I think the Somali leaders are gonna be like, please do not do this. They're gonna deport all of us if you riot. And that's another reason they don't want to riot, is that if there's local leaders who can, and I think that's the same with black community, where there were people who would agitate these elements, but they're like, do not do this. This is going to be a gift to Trump. And it would be a gift to Trump if they rioted. The LA riots last summer over ICE raids helped Trump. And they turned out, because it's like, look at these radical violent elements, illegal immigrant elements. Look at what they're doing. we need to get more of them out of the country. So, I don't, even if it was just a normal police shooting of a white officer shooting a black woman, which it just wouldn't happen because blacks are not going to get themselves involved in this unless they're like a really white black person who, probably has a white lesbian lover or something of that sort. They're not going to involve themselves in this. They're focused on their own matter. And you can see like the black reaction is that there's a hilarious cell phone video of it, whereas the black guy's like, oh, hell no, they're all out here. And he's like, checks out this ICE agent, like, oh, damn, she thick as hell. And that's like their reaction. They're just like, it goes from like, oh, damn, they shot that woman to like admiring the ass of some ICE officer. So they're not as like, if they was really worked up about it, I don't think he would have the time to notice the ICE agent is thick as hell. But that's my views on the ICE shooting. I think it's 100% justified. I think that the only proper response is to back the ICE agent. If you are crying over his actions, if you are, going off on this and saying this is horrible or saying this is horrible optics, or really the worst thing is if you think that this is a distraction, that we can mass deport 10 million people without upsetting anyone, you're a fucking moron and you're in practice a leftist. That's it. Like this is how mass deportations work. This is going to be the result. And if you're getting a weak stomach over this and are complaining about it and saying this is meant to prevent more mass deportations, you're just frankly a moron and should not air your political opinions anywhere, like even in private conversation. And I get sick of that when all these people are like, we could easily deport 10 million people without upsetting anyone. And it's like, no, you have to do this. People are like, well, we just punish them and but don't send any officers out there. And we've done this in the past. They don't leave. And even if they're like not able to get jobs, they'll just stay in random cities where they're able to get government benefits, like Minneapolis, Maine, Illinois. There's a lot of places where illegal immigrants can easily get government benefits. And most of the illegal immigrants who came here under Biden were coming for government benefits, not to work. So that's a stupid argument, even if you're arresting employers. We've done this in the past. They don't leave. You have to have terror tactics to leave. If illegal immigrants think that they're going to be sent to a supermax prison in El Salvador, they're going to leave. And if we've seen the numbers, there's starting to numbers to come out that about 3 million, it was the past number was 2.2 million. And these numbers came out in like August, September, but it's likely over 3 million have left. And most of those are self-deportations because they're terrified of ending up in the supermax in El Salvador or some godforsaken country in Africa, and they're terrified of ICE agents breaking down the door. You have to have the terror tactics to leave, and this is the type of things that are going to happen when you try to enforce the laws and try to make America great again. And if you're getting a weak stomach for it, you don't have what it takes to support mass deportations. And it's like this guy highlighted who is like a mass deportationist in his bio, and he's crying over this, and this is like what happens. And if you think this is a distraction, you think this is unnecessary, you don't understand what it takes to achieve what we want. So that is my thoughts on that. So yeah, it's likely not good for the admin. It's happened with more normie. It upsets normies, but I always get this about tariffs and other things that hurt people's bottom line. That's why I don't think that the administration shouldn't do too many radical things that might upset the public, because we want them to. The one thing that we can upset the public on or go radical is mass deportations. While I think everything else needs to be calm and moderate in order to create the public goodwill to have people ignore the mass deportations. But if people's economic fortunes are hurting, they're going to pay more attention to this and turn on the admin and Republicans and a right-wing agenda. But it's necessary to do. These things are going to happen if we're going to do mass deportations. You either have mass deportations and run the risk of this happening again, or you don't have deportations at all. That's your choice. There's no third option here. There's no secret third option where you deport 100 million migrants and no one is upset and no one gets hurt in the process, and there's no videos of anything that might upset the public. That is just impossible. And if you think that, you might as well go off to Hogwarts or some other fantasy land, because you are not fit to understand political reality. So that is my thoughts on the ICE shooting. Now for my thoughts on Greenland. I guess I'll give short thoughts on this because I've 30 minutes in. I'm just going to repeat my tweet I had. I think, I am relatively neutral on this. It's probably, we do need to keep the EU on our side. But it's also the EU overstates how much independence it has. But we should still be like, okay, you can have Greenland, we can do more projects. Now, somebody explained this to me, is the reason why that it's harder to share projects is that American projects are subject to EU's idiotic regulations and stuff when they do things in Greenland. And it'd be a lot easier and convenient if we were just subject to our own laws and regulations, and we could do a whole lot more. And that's why we've pared down a lot of these projects in Greenland, because we're tired of dealing with the EU nonsense. It might be, we might just have to deal with it or negotiate some we're not subject to the regulations anymore. We could work out some deal. I think it's better to share Greenland, but to renegotiate our access to it, that essentially we get to do what we want, but it's nominally in Denmark's hands. They have access to it if they want, but we're running the show in the way we see fit. But it's still part of it's still part of Denmark. We don't need to take it. They still have access to it. They're not getting denied, but we're able to do our projects more with a greater degree of independence than we are in the past. And I think that's the best solution. And you almost have to push them, but the Euro's reaction almost justified just annexing it. Eurocrats are just people. I'm one of the few Americans who gets upset about some of the, anti-European stuff, but a lot of the Europeans bring this on themselves. And the idea that Europe, all these people who are wanting to fight to death over Greenland, view Russia as their mortal enemy and don't want to make a peace deal over Ukraine. So they want to fight Russia and America at the same time, when the EU is insanely weak and depending on one of the three great powers of the world to, have as its ally. I guess they would want China, but they're not even that eager to align with China. They just imagine an independent Europe, which is, doesn't have the resources of the other three great powers, doesn't have nowhere near the military might, our military ability, our capacity to fight and die as them, and they're weak and divided. They can't, agree on common policy. They don't have a common military. Their militaries are jokes compared to America, China, and Russia, despite what's happening in Ukraine. And some of them will be like, well, what's happening in Ukraine? And Euros will do stolen valor of what the Ukrainians do and say that the Danes will fight to death in the trenches over Greenland. There is zero chance of that happening. There is no chance. First off, the Danish military, it's like you're about to fuck with the mighty Danish military. It's like, I don't think we need to worry about the Danish military. I don't want to make too many jokes, but the Europeans are bringing themselves on this. And online, once again, these are all these Euro right-wingers who are coming online who tweet all day in English. It's like, you're so anti-American. Why the fuck are you tweeting all day in English? You are showing a sign of how American cultural and imperial dominance if you're tweeting all day in fucking English and talking about our political affairs. You are not talking about what's happening in Germany and France as much as you're talking about the ICE shooting in Minneapolis. So you're not, you're hating the thing you're indulging in every day. In any case, these guys just imagine that America empire is going to fall once we fight the mighty EU army over fucking Greenland. It's not going to happen. And Eurocrats, the leadership of the continent is terrible. These people, they censor anyone who opposes immigration. They have terrible hate speech laws. They have regulations that cripple business. These are the people ruining the continent. And the average European isn't even aware of Greenland, of having access to Greenland. It still is important to Europe's long-term prospects, is because they have to have access to the Arctic, and they're going to need access to the Arctic in the future, and all they've got is Scandinavia. So it's much better to keep Greenland within their orbit But, the average European wasn't aware of this, and they're not going to fight and die over it. And it is ridiculous to say this. And the European reaction almost justifies the annexation of it. It is funny that this whole diplomatic row is caused by Katie Miller, Stephen Miller's wife, tweeting a meme of like a American flag over Greenland, and they're like, we don't do this in Germany," and then they go and have this meltdown over it. But it's you do need a better relationship with Europe, but Europe doesn't want to face reality of what it's like. It's that it's a weak vassal, whether that's correct or not. They're a weak vassal entity of the United States. They're utterly dependent on us, for where they get defense weaponry, for defense. Even though they're spending more, their militaries are still going to be jokes compared to the American military. Maybe you could argue that shouldn't be the case, but they've decided this, after two devastating world wars that destroyed the continent and killed their appetite for war, that they moved in a less militaristic direction, and they don't have the people who are willing to fight and die like they did 100 years ago. So a lot of them died and didn't reproduce. So it's not the same. And you could say, well, maybe you want a stronger independent Europe. I'm open to that, is that they're less dependent on us. I think that would be better for both America and Europe. Well, they got to figure out who they want to ally with. And they currently just think that they can be an independent great power on their own while hostile to both America and Russia. They're fighting, they're apparently going to fight and defeat Russia and the Ukraine, or the Ukrainians are. I don't know who they're going to utilize as their people, as their cannon fodder in Greenland, but they're going to fight and die and defeat America and Greenland. And, there's a lot of fantastical notions. And America, the thing about Trump is, for better or for worse, he is dropping the pretense that Europe, they're equal partners, and, we're not an empire, and we're going to work together, and we're going to pretend that Europe is a mighty state. And he's just dropping the pretense, and it's like, we're tired of supporting your systems. We're tired of providing the defense that has allowed you to have these extravagant welfare states that has hurt your long-term prospects. And we want you to pay your fair share in defense. And we're also more inclined to just leave you to having your own defense. They complained about the national security strategy, which was going to grant Europe a degree of independence that they've not had before. At the same time, it is meaning that they get a crappier trade deal, but they would get less oversight by America, and there'd be a pullback from NATO, and all the Europeans flipped out about it. So it's they can't figure out what they want. They really want the past pretense and false reality that they are a great power and they're fully equal with America, and they can pretend that they're what they say matters in the world. And Trump has just dropped that, and they're really pissed off about it. And we see that in Greenland. I still think, I'm neutral about it. If we took Greenland, we took it. I don't think we will. It's probably a waste of diplomatic capital, but I think it's necessary to negotiate a better deal where we're able to do our projects the way we see fit, independent of EU oversight and regulations. That's probably the best. That's probably the best deal we can get, and we should strive for that. We probably shouldn't waste the political capital into Greenland in the first place. But Europeans are inviting it when their response to this is just so outrageous and preposterous and based in fantasy of what their capabilities are. And they got to play nice with America. It's like with the trade deal. They threatened to do a trade war, and then their leaders were like, "Oh, we'd be royally screwed by this." And then they agreed to a humiliating trade deal with us, which I don't know if we should have done. I probably am more opposed to that than making a more pro-American Greenland trade deal, but we did it anyway, and Europe has no power to resist it. And if they have no power to resist our trade deal demands, they certainly have no power to resist us annexing Greenland. But they should keep that in mind and make a better deal for us so we can both share Greenland. So that is my takes on that. Now we'll go to questions we've got. We'll go with Gillis Enjoyer first. other questions, he said, do you think the administration is getting enough support to keep morale high? You've mentioned before it's important that they don't think the base is abandoning them or else they stop trying to push through a base agenda. And the online right is more full of doomers than ever. I have to think you have to distinguish the base from the online right. The online right is not the base. The base is represented by Fox News and a lot of these Rumble casts, even though the Rumble casts are starting to turn on them, the base are the people going to Trump's rallies, and they're much more of a grassroots oriented thing. The online right is separate from the base. Now, sometimes the online right is in sync with the base. Sometimes they're opposition towards it, and most of the base is really excited about what Trump's doing. They think everything he's doing is awesome. He has extremely high favorables among Republicans, so there's no real turning on Trump from the base. There was a lot of people in the base who had questions about how he handled Epstein, but most of these things that people claim that the base is turning on, like Iran, over 90% of MAGA Republicans backed the Iran bombing, whether we like it or not. I think the Iran bombing we shouldn't have done. The Venezuela raid, once again, they're overwhelmingly supportive of it. They're not losing the base. They're just pissing off the online right. So I think it's like, do you think that the administration is getting enough support from the online right? I would say that they're getting a lot more support with the ICE agent, even though I mentioned all these idiotic right wingers who are crying tears over it, acting, this is outrageous, this is terrible, as they've got like a swastika in their bio and stuff. The majority of people, the majority of right wing influencers who have been either on the fence about Trump or, go back and forth on Trump have been supportive of the administration in this fight. So, and I also saw a lot of people who were very supportive of the Venezuelan raid that maybe otherwise wouldn't have been. So they got, the thing is, like, people were worried about the public. I mean, the public doesn't care about the Venezuela case. There's no troops there. It's like, well, I guess we shouldn't have done that. But it's like it's not something that's really hyping them up. They with the ICE shooting, I think that has a bigger impact on normies, but the online right seems largely supportive of it, except for these very vocal Wignats and Euro right wingers who've decided it's the worst tragedy ever, But I think overall they're not getting as much, because I think there are a lot of right wing influencers who, whatever happens, they focus on their pet issues. Is that they immediately go to, Venezuela happens. Well, why aren't we doing this to federal judges? Well, we're prevented from doing that by the laws of the country. And that would be insanely unpopular. And a lot of people who suggest this stuff are talking about the bad optics of an ICE agent shooting a leftist who's driving at him. So that's not going to happen. That's just not going to happen. So then they suggest fantasy. And then, this ICE shooting happens and they're like, we need to mobilize every soldier to arrest every liberal in the country. It's like they focus on their pet issues and they create these impossible demands no matter what news event. And these impossible demands are never going to be met, and then they blackpill their audience. And I think it's that a huge problem with the right-wing online influencer network is that they're setting impossible demands that are not demanded by anyone in the base. Even though mass deportations, people want mass deportations, but they don't want to cripple the economy in response to it, or deport their favorite lawnmower or whatever. They have more reasonable expectations for this. But the online right is like, oh, they haven't deported 50 million a year. I'm giving up on Trump and voting for Newsom. And that's always what happens, is like, I'm taking my ball and going home if I don't meet these impossible demands. The problem is that the online right doesn't command actual voters. And we're starting to learn that with these online right candidates who are running in Ohio and Florida and elsewhere. And their, real polling shows them at most with 5%. And they have no real support among actual people, but people think that they're serious because they have a lot of online right support. But the online right does not have the ability to command voters or sway elections as much as the online right think they do. And so we have to be much more pro-Trump than I think, and set reasonable demands for the administration. I think it's worthwhile to criticize. I'm not one of those people who say you can never criticize them. I criticize them about student visas. I criticize them about the tariffs all the time. Even though a lot of the online right doesn't do it, I criticize them about his H-1B comments. I am willing to criticize, and I criticize them about their, moves to bomb Iran. I'm willing to criticize the administration. I think the online right should do, but I think is that a lot of times we criticize them for not doing the impossible, and then we blackpill our audience and encourage them to vote Democrats in response to them not meeting our impossible demands. And so I think the real issue is that the online right is misunderstands its influence of the base. It doesn't have as much influence over the base as it does, and it doesn't represent the base as much of it as it thinks it does. And as well as the demands we're setting are not going to be achieved, and they end up just blackpilling our audience, and we turn into more of a corner to bitch about everything Trump is not doing rather than to provide a support. And if Trump sees this as just a source of criticism, then they're going to zone us out. And it's what's happening with, even though everyone hates Vivek, and obviously I have my problems with Vivek, Vivek has decided to go with a completely offline campaign, which will likely benefit his campaign. And if he wins, that's going to be a huge blow to the online right, because it's going to show that this guy who made himself a name through online presence and online commentary decided to go offline and actually became governor of Ohio, and showed that you can do this in spite of being the most hated Republican by the online right, and it doesn't matter in elections. And if Republicans get that message, that's not good for the online right. Second question, do you agree that regime change in Iran would be good for us as long as there are no U.S. boots on the ground? No. I think the thing is, he says that Iran is the main source of instability and therefore refugees for the region. And he says if the regime is replaced with a U.S.-friendly one or even neutral one, suddenly there is no reason to care about the region anymore. We pivot it even harder to the Asia-Pacific. I think theoretically, if you just replaced it with a region, a government that can keep it together, that would be fine. It's whatever. I mean, the mullahs suck. I'm not supportive of them. I'm not one of those people who's like, hands off Iran. I mean, we should not get involved. We should have no military strikes there. We should not set. The issue is that the most likely scenario is that it descends into civil war, is that it turns into another Syria, because the mullahs and IRGC know that they're going to likely be killed by the next government. Also, it doesn't seem that there's a force that can unite all these disparate and disparate dissident elements, because there's ethnic minorities that have their own interests. There's these college students and urban populations that have their own interests, and their urban populations means something different here than our urban populations. And what alternative force can come and lead them and keep the country together? And I don't really see that, because it's all these foreign dissidents who don't seem to have much influence on the ground, like the MEK, who are communists who helped the mullahs take over and then got the mullahs turned on them. I'm not sure if they have any influence on the ground. The Shah certainly doesn't have any influence on the ground. So who's going to take over? And really the best scenario for regime change would be Khomeini dies and a moderate cleric takes over and pushes them in a different direction. I don't think revolution is going to be, a violent revolution is the best way for us to have Iran. Khomeini is not going to live very long. I mean, he's, I think, in his late 80s. So he's not going to be around much longer. The best thing to do is just to wait for, him to be, I'm not suggesting assassination, because that's just going to turn him a martyr, and that's probably going to radicalize the regime ever. But it's just like to wait for him to die of natural causes, most likely once he dies. And also the fact is most of the Iranian government is all these old boomers, or the Iranian equivalent to boomer, who were around for the revolution. They're old, they're getting replaced, and eventually Iran will moderate on its own over the next 10 years. But I think a violent revolution is going to lead to what we've seen in Syria, Libya, Iraq, when we toppled Saddam, and you basically have a civil war that sends countless numbers of refugees here, destabilizes the region. Eventually, it could even become a proxy war between competing Gulf competing Middle Eastern powers, because now it's like there's all these proxy war. There's now a proxy UAE and Saudi Arabia are now competing for Middle Eastern hegemony, and along with there's maybe Turkey could turn on the Gulf states. It'd be all the Sunni powers coming in there, but I don't think we experience enough tragedy and awful things that come out of the Syrian civil war. I don't think we should strive for that in Iran. And I think that's the most likely scenario with a regime change. Maybe there's a more moderate leader or cleric that say they depose Khamenei, and then there's a moderate cleric who takes over, who then transitions them into a stable, more pro-U.S. government. But that's a bet, and you don't know if that person's going to have the charisma and authority to do that. So sometimes it's better to deal with the devil you know than rather than the. Actually, it's usually better to deal with the devil you know rather than the devil you don't know. And I think that's one of the problems with the regime change. So I don't think regime change is really good for world stability because it will likely lead to conflict in the Middle East, and we could potentially be drawn in over time, like we were drawn in from what happened with the Arab Spring into the Middle East. So something to look out for. Now, Nitro's got a great question. He said, thoughts on James Fishback's appearance on Tucker Carlson? Well, it's not surprising Tucker Carlson endorsed him, but, it is showing he's running an influencer campaign that's not dealing with voter issues. I think if you're wanting to run for Florida governor, saying the Jews run the state is probably not the best way to campaign on. I mean, if you're an influencer or a commentator, you can say whatever you want. But, he's out there. It's really funny how he talks. It's like I find him amusing on like Casey Putsch. Like Putsch, I have no time to even contemplate. But Fishback I do find him funny and just what he does at his campaign. He talks like a chat GPT. It's like, well, let me tell you, Tucker, the thing that happens with this government is that it is a bad thing. And Benjamin Netanyahu, I want to say, be very clear. He's a war criminal. It's like a weird, like they all went to like Barack Obama camp and they figured out, some ways his speaking style. It's not completely the same, but it is like a super, like anybody listening, it's like very put on. Like, I don't think this is his normal voice, and he does this in all his interviews. I mean, it's much more, you pay much more attention to it than the average politician, such as Byron Donalds. Like, Byron Donalds doesn't have much charisma, but it is like a ChatGPT bot. And a lot of his tweets also resemble that too. But he has like a funny campaign, and he's like talking about Jews and stuff. It is interesting that he's now turned entirely on DeSantis, which, he began his campaign as the pro-DeSantis anti-Trump guy. And he got a lot of DeSantoids who were backing him because they were all, before he announced like DeSantoids, if you watched the influencers, they were all attacking Byron Donalds. They hated Byron Donalds, and they're preparing for the DeSantis candidate. They hoped it would be Casey DeSantis, but they might accept the lieutenant governor. And then when Fishback announced himself, he was like presenting himself as the DeSantoid candidate. And a lot of DeSantoids liked him. And then he, obviously the DeSantoids are very pro-Israel, and then he made anti-Israel his main campaign issue, and he's running for governor of Florida on an anti-Israel platform, which is, the governor of Israel doesn't determine our foreign policy. Now, the governor of Florida at the same time does a lot of pro-Israel stuff they shouldn't do. I mean, he's governor of Florida. This isn't his business. But at the same time, like, that's not, the governor of Florida doesn't deal with that matter. And so he's focusing on all these online issues. And if you listen to his podcast, it's all things that really ordinary Florida voters don't care about. And it's not something that a governor says. It's an influencer discussion. And his campaign is just to build himself up to be an influencer. And it is what it is. I don't take him very seriously, but it is like funny. I think that's still the funniest thing about the James Fishback campaign is they had to apologize to the anti-Semitic community for being friendly with Barry Weiss. And it's like, this is quite the campaign in Florida. And Florida is like one of the few states where Jewish voters are significant enough to impact elections and even a Republican primary. So Fishback, I don't know. This just show that online right politics don't translate well into electoral politics. Because you have to focus on a lot. You have to make concessions. You have to focus on local issues. You have to meet where voters actually are. And voters are nowhere near where the online right is. And eventually you just kind of have these like clown show campaigns that are going around. And they resemble, influencer battles than, actual campaigns. And that is the case with Fishback. But it was a There's funny moments with it. So it is interesting that he's now presenting himself as the anti-DeSantis candidate. I guess anti-Trump as well, even though I don't think he really, I think he at least has enough intelligence to not attack Trump, but he is, which Casey Putsch in Ohio does not have the intelligence to, because he's full on anti-Trump. But Fishback, it's more implied he's anti-Trump, but he has no chance of the primary. All the polls put him at 5% at most, and I don't think that when voters get to know him more, are they gonna want to support him. But it is what it is. But I think the main testament to both Push and Fishback is it shows that online right politics don't translate well into electoral politics, and especially with priorities that people have that they want these candidates to talk about, and it's not really what ordinary voters care about. It is what it is. So we will go with Ken. Ken's other question was, can you break down the Jaguars game and the Trevor Lawrence sloppy Joe down the middle into an interception to end it? It wasn't that much of his fault. Like, first off, it hit the receiver's hands. It popped up and then it went into a cornerback's hands. It wasn't that bad of a call or pass. It's one of those accidents. It's not like he threw the ball and it went straight to a cornerback. I don't think it was that bad. There was a play earlier in the game where it was a bad throw or a throw he shouldn't have made, like an interception earlier. But that interception ended was the receiver almost caught it, popped up, went in a quarterback's hand. They do talk about that there was a receiver more open down the middle, but it's a quarterback. He's got defensive ends coming at him. He makes a split-second decision, and it was a catchable ball. But it didn't end that. So it's not a bad interception. I don't think it was terrible because it wasn't like that it went straight into the cornerback's hands. So, but the Jaguars, I mean, they had a thing. They're a young team. They're not as playoff experienced as the Bills. And really right now is that the player that you would want in high pressure games and playoffs is Josh Allen. Now, Josh Allen, I don't know how well he's going to do. He is really banged up. And even in the game, he was playing on a bad foot. And he got banged up even more in the game. Like he, hurt his fingers because he hit it on the helmet of another guy throwing. And he was in serious pain. He got a ton of other injuries or bruised. He was really battered throughout the game. So I don't know how well he's going to do next week. Well, they'll be playing against the Broncos next week, but I don't know how well. I guess I think Josh Allen deserves a Super Bowl, so I'd root for the Bills now to give Allen a Super Bowl ring, even though I don't think the Bills are the best team this year. But Allen deserves to go to the Super Bowl. So it's fine though, Jack. They lost to, who else would you rather them lose to? But yeah, just games go like that. You have unlucky breaks, and that was the interception. So that's my thoughts on the Jaguars game. But I have all my other picks in my playoff. I did not do this through FanDuel. I did not put any money on it, but I had a bracket, and I am 4 for 5. And if the Texans win tonight, I will be 5 for 6. So I had all my other predictions correct, but I predicted the Jaguars to win the Super Bowl. So I think my bracket is destroyed otherwise. So we will go to Gillis Enjoyers, I actually already got him. I meant Arm Day Enjoyer, other enjoyer. He said, while things like the space race defined Anglo-Americans' Faustian spirit, many normal white Americans still think there really isn't a white culture. My assumption is because they view those higher aspirations as something they can't be involved in, unlike third world slop food or third world festivals. Just wanting your opinion on that. Well, a lot of normal white American culture is what's around us. It's like respecting laws, Christmas, Thanksgiving, July 4th parades. All these things are ordinary American culture is white culture. The thing is not exclusive to us. We like it to be inclusive of everyone. It's like, you can celebrate Christmas whoever you are, and Thanksgiving and July 4th, and you can follow rules too, and you can play football as well and enjoy baseball. We think it's open to the whole world. And a lot of other cultures is they think it's very exclusive to themselves, and there's a higher barrier of entry. And even what's authentic, like white American culture, we like to be inclusive. Even something like country, which is very white, we like to love that, minorities listen to it. And I guess that's like a very specific thing to Anglos is that we, in order to validate the things we like, we need minority faces there. So really with white culture is just what's all around you and what you grew up celebrating, but people don't recognize that as specifically white culture. We just celebrate that as American culture. But and this is both a problem. I guess it's a bit of a problem. It's both a problem and maybe a benefit, is that normal mainstream American culture is white culture. It's the product of whites, but we don't view it as exclusive to whites, and we view it as open to all Americans who come here and embrace American culture and assimilate to it. But that's what our culture is. But some people try to make it with even pop culture, and I even see this with like all these remember what they took from me. It's like Pizza Hut and stuff. There was a really bad one where they did. I don't know if this was joking, but it was like, look at how the world's changed. It's like the world you grew up in with is no longer. And then they had like a 2011 street view of this strip mall and it had like Toys R Us and Chuck E. Cheese, and now it was like a Amazon store and I think Bed Bath and Beyond. And it actually looked like an improvement. And they were like, I couldn't believe it. I couldn't figure out if it was a joke or not. And the commenters were divided on it as well. But it's not too far off from what people seriously post unironically post. So it is that. But I think that's the one difference, is that it's hard for white Americans to think of these as specifically white things are unique to them when it's open to all. And it's just standard American culture. His second question is, I guess to go back on to thinking about that, you in order to educate themselves, the really great things about like the Constitution, space race, our market economy, the ability to, live free without, too onerous of taxation and property rights and, the type of American dream we have, we do have to be a better job of just saying this is a product of whiteness. And then once whiteness is a cultural value disappears or is denigrated, then the American dream disappears with it as well. I think it's a job for our side to communicate that to the general public. On a second thing, he said, on a related note, despite the talk of Hispanization, you can't really fundamentally change who people are. Like John Smith can't walk into a Mexican restaurant, but he won't turn into one. Well, that's because he's an adult. But when you're a child, you can transform yourself. If you grow up, and you're learning Spanish and stuff and going to a Mexican restaurant and you're surrounded by Hispanics, and you will adopt their ways. But once you're an adult, you are a fully formed individual. You are likely not going to learn Spanish or change who you are. So you're not going to walk in that Mexican restaurant and change that. But the children who experience that in school will experience that Hispanization, is that they're surrounded by people and their values. It's the same with like white kids who grow up in like a lot of black neighborhoods. A lot of them become Wiggers because that's the norm and they assimilate to that norm. So it's more of a thing you have to worry about with the children rather than with adults. And you can fundamentally change the people when you change the children. This has always happened with like the languages they learn when, they had all the tribal invasions in Europe, and the languages they decided to learn, the children, their adults may have learned a certain language and practices a certain religion, and then the children learned a different religion from their mothers and a different religion from their mothers, and eventually that transformed the people. And so it's through the children where you have the most cultural effects, not through adults. So let's see. We got deuteronormative. Let me make sure there's no questions. I need to refresh to see there's any other questions. Nope. Might be. I wonder if some people might get them in after the buzzer, but we'll see. But deuteronormative has two questions. He said, will Trump's executive order banning mail-in ballots and tabulation machines make it through the courts? I don't think so, because the courts generally uphold the state's right to oversee elections how they see fit. And so it's very difficult for us on a federal level to make those blanket bans and decisions. It would have to take an act of Congress for that to happen. I don't think an executive order is not going to be held up. I think if Congress passed a bill saying banning mail-in out ballots, that might work. But even there, and it might be iffy because we generally leave elections to the states, and it's usually for the best because imagine if Democratic supermajority. I mean, what they wanted with the John Lewis Voting Rights Act in 2021, it would have been a permanent Democratic majority for all time if they had passed it. It'd have been like completely no oversight of mail-in ballots, complete federal oversight, and all these things. So it's often better for the states to oversee the courts, but it's more about these battleground states where we've got to get Republicans in power in Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin in order to better their elections, and in Arizona and elsewhere, and then you can make it better for us. I mean, Trump won all those states, but to ensure down ballot Republicans win, you're going to need to do this. But it's better on the state level. But I don't think an executive order is going to hold up. Legislation would be even a tough legal battle. But a legislation would have better time in court. You can't. Courts generally say it's prerogative of the states to determine their own elections. Certainly not the president. It would have to go through Congress. But it's a good measure. I think we need to. It still puts pressure on this and keeps that issue alive to ensure Republicans are also focusing on it. The second question is, racial ethnic lines seem to be much more blurry in South America than in North America. Do you think this has an effect on increasing the salience of class identity? Well, generally throughout Latin America, the whiter you are, the more likely you'll be upper class. So it's like a color aligns with class. Even much more so than it does in America, because now we've got Indians and Asians and all in the upper class. So it's a little bit harder. I mean, you do have blacks and Hispanics at the bottom, but it's in Latin America, it's much more along color lines. So I'm not quite sure if you mean this in America, the salience of class identity. Latin America, I don't think that they don't seem as strong of a class identity that Europe does. Like Europe has extremely strong class identity, and they're much more static than they are in America. America has very fluid class identity. You can grow up in a working class family, but then you get really good SAT score, go to a good school, and then move up into the elites. That's still the case. Now, that usually doesn't happen as often due to, I forget the specific term, but we've been, over several generations, we've been pairing off people with, if you have two moron parents or parents that didn't do so well, it's pretty much likely you're going to be like them. Well, we've had the SAT for generations that have been picking out the smartest kids, and they've been able to go to the good schools. So we still have exceptions like J.D. Vance and others, but you don't see it as often. But it still can happen. Or you can just be, grow up in a working class family, and then you start your own business and you make a lot of money, and then you elevate. There's multiple paths to rising out of your station, and it's the same with the upper class. Like, you could be, have a very affluent family, but you're a shithead drug addict, and your parents cut you out, and you end up among the lumpen proletariat and a petty criminal. That's very much the case. Like, there's much more fluid class dynamic, which there's not as much of the case historically in Europe. I'm not quite sure if it's in Latin America, because Latin America, I don't think that they just have a lot of poor people and a lot of rich people, and I don't think that they have as much of a developed middle class, and they don't view themselves as having a middle class society like we have. Like, the middle class is the norm for us, but in a lot of Latin American places, the slums are the norm, and that is not middle class. So I'm not quite sure if you mean that about Latin America, but it works differently from class. I would be hesitant to say, like, I will say this: there's a sharper divide between rich and poor in Latin America than there is in America. We like to view the rich and poor as all being middle class. There is starting to be now income-wise, there's obviously a massive gap, but culturally and socially, we like to view everyone as on the same plane. Now, that might not be so much the case anymore, but historically and as an ideal, we think that. But in Latin America, there's not even an ideal. It's like rich, poor, and it's why socialism is much more popular in Latin America because the poor feel that there is no way for them to ever escape poverty, while everyone in America thinks that if they work hard enough, they can achieve the American dream. So that is my answer to that. And I think we are now down to LK Rurik. If I didn't get your question, just remind me and I will get it for Wednesday. And his question is, a while back I saw a video of a black woman on X calling local churches to ask for baby formula and was going to ask about it but forgot, but better late than never. Can you criticize this strain of religious thought that doesn't seem to know that churches are not welfare offices, or as I like to call it, Gibbs-tianity? I'm not quite that familiar with the idea, but there are people who always imagine that churches can provide charity independent of welfare, which I'm very critical of welfare, but churches are strapped for resources. They can barely keep open churches, so they're not capable of this. The real thing I think with the right is that, I don't know, because most of the people who really emphasize on like feeding the poor and or from a Christian perspective, even on the right, they end up being socialists and think the government should assume this job. And some right-wingers think that churches should take up some degree of public service that we assign to the state. I see this a lot with schools. Like we need to end property taxes. I got this a lot when I'm talking about my property tax defenses, that these guys are like, we'll just end property taxes and churches will take this over. And I'm like, first off, like churches can barely keep a roof over their heads. And right now is that most churches are shutting down, and you just imagine that they can now add an additional burden with little public funding because you ended property taxes to take this up, and that becomes a form of charity. But most people think that they want churches to be welfare offices. I guess that's a very much of a left wing thing. Sometimes they're like, well, why don't churches give more to the poor? And they're trying to support themselves. So the issue is that they don't have enough. They barely have enough resources to keep themselves open. They certainly don't have the resources to become welfare offices. So, yeah, it's rather stupid. I'm trying to interpret this way. I guess you think this is more the left wing way of leftists who like attack churches for not, giving all the resources to the poor, but the resources they have to keep themselves open to maintain themselves. Do remodeling and renovations to keep themselves open. And they often struggle to do that when they have declining membership. So they're not welfare offices. But in other terms, like with some of the right-wing thought of this, that the churches can overtake public services, once again, same thing, is they're barely able to keep themselves open. They're not going to run. I mean, some churches can run their own schools now, but if they're not running their own schools now, they're not going to have the ability to do so once you end property taxes. So I always find that, you shouldn't treat churches as welfare offices. So we'll both agree on that. So that is it for Highly Respected today. We're going to be back on our normal schedule this week. We're going to have an article tomorrow, Mailbag Wednesday, Article Thursday, IQ Supplement Friday. So be on the lookout for that. So until next time, stay respected.